$20 and a sole $20 could buy a sturdy mule or a decent rifle. It should never have bought a man. Caleb stood in the corner of Miller's trading post, a shadow sunk deep into a buffalo hide coat, waiting for his sack of salt and coffee beans. The floorboards were slick with spit and the melted snow from hobnail boots. Outside, the November wind howled like a living thing, tearing at the timbered joints. Inside, it was too damn loud. Caleb hated the noise. He hated the crush of bodies, the reek of wet wool, and the thin, brittle laughter of men pretending they weren't one bad snowfall away from starvation. He kept his eyes down, his calloused fingers tracing the rim of his tin mug. Then the shouting started, erupting near the hearth. "She's a mouth to feed. I don't need $20. Who's got $20? It was Amos, an old miner who stank of sulfur and bad decisions. His beard was yellowed with chewing tobacco spit. His thick, blunt hands were clamped tight around a braid of black hair. Attached to the braid was a girl. Caleb didn't bother looking up at first. This edge of the world was full of bad things. A man learned to close his eyes to rot if he wanted to keep his sanity. He took a drink of his black coffee. It tasted like burnt tin. Look at her, young, strong enough. Knows how to cook. Knows how to scrub. Amos yanked the braid. The girl stumbled, her knees hitting the rough-hewn floorboards with a hollow thud. But she didn't cry out. It was her silence that drew Caleb's gaze. She looked maybe 20, though the grime and exhaustion made it hard to tell, for sure. She wore a burlap sack, hacked into a crude dress cinched at the waist with a frayed rope. Her legs were wrapped in rough-spun cloth, tied with braided twine. No boots. In this weather, no boots were a death sentence, but it was her face that made Caleb's gut clench. There was no terror in her eyes, only a flat, deadly pragmatism. She was scanning the room, calculating her chances of survival, appraising the drunkards and the thieves, who were looking back at her with hungry, empty eyes. A one-eared miner spat into the fire. $10 and a bottle of rot gut. $20 cash, Amos roared, shoving the girl's arm up. The burlap tore. A dark, ugly bruise bloomed around her bicep. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. "Not your business," a voice rasped in his head. "You live up on the ridge for a reason. You don't get mixed up with people. You don't play the hero." He set his tin mug down on the counter. The clink of metal on wood was faint, but it screamed in his mind. Caleb didn't stride forward like a savior. He shuffled. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his fur coat, angry at his own weakness. He hated Amos. He hated the miner. But most of all, he hated himself for not being able to look away and finish his coffee. Caleb reached into the deep canvas pocket of his pants. His fingers brushed against two soft, crumpled bills. It had taken him a month of trapping beaver to earn it. Money meant for a new axe head and powder for the winter. He stopped in front of Amos. The man stank like a physical blow, unwashed hide and rotten teeth. Caleb said nothing. He pulled his hand from his pocket, letting the two $10 bills slip through his scarred fingers, fluttering down into the muck and sawdust between Amos's boot heels. The room fell into a dead quiet. The only sound was the hiss of wet wood in the hearth. Amos looked down at the money, then up at Caleb's face. Caleb's eyes were hidden by the brim of his hat, but his jaw, framed by a grizzled beard shot with silver, showed no room for compromise. Amos released his grip. He bent down, his thick fingers scrabbling in the sawdust for the bills. Caleb didn't look at the crowd or the girl. He reached out, his gloved fingers closing loosely around her unbruised wrist. "Move," he grumbled, his voice a rasp of gravel, unused to forming words. They were barely off the porch when the freezing rain lashed them like buckshot. The cold hit instantly, biting through Caleb's thick coat. He felt her flinch, her whole body trembling violently as the sleet struck her bare, mud-caked neck. His enormous, ill-tempered horse copper was tethered to the post. Caleb untied the reins. He looked back at the girl. She stood in ankle-deep mud, the rough-spun leg wrapping soaked through. She shivered so hard, her teeth chattered. Caleb sighed, exhaling a plume of white breath into the frigid air. He put his arm around her waist and lifted her. She was light, like lifting a bundle of dry kindling. He set her on the saddle, then swung up behind her. He spread the tails of his buffalo coat wide, pulling the excess fur over her shivering body, holding her pressed tight against his chest. She immediately went rigid. A knot of tense muscle pressed against his sternum. She didn't lean into his warmth, she endured it. They rode up the mountain in absolute silence. The trail was a slick ribbon of black mud and wet rock. Her scent reached him. Lye soap, old sweat, and a metallic tang he knew instantly, the smell of dried blood. Caleb stared at the jagged pines clawing at the bruised gray sky. What the hell had he done? He didn't have enough food for two people. He didn't have the patience for company. He was a man who'd rather be friends with the wolves than with people. And now, a bruised frozen woman sat before him, bought with the price of his winter ammunition. The cabin sagged into a notch in the mountainside, built straight into the cliff face as if it had grown there. By the time they arrived, the sun was dead, leaving only a bruised, smudged twilight like spilled ink. Caleb slid off the horse, reaching down to pull the girl after him. Her legs immediately buckled when they hit the frozen ground. Caleb caught her by the shoulders, a grip firm enough to keep her upright, but loose enough not to hurt. He kicked open the heavy oak door and pushed her inside. The air in the cabin was still and cold, smelling of ashes and smoked venison. Caleb said nothing. He went straight to the hearth, striking a match against the stone. Sulfur flared, casting sharp dancing shadows on the rough-hewn logs. He gathered dry moss and tinder, feeding the flames until the oak caught and began to crackle. He turned. She hadn't moved from the doorway. She stood there, dripping onto the wooden floor. In the firelight, he could finally see her face clearly, sharp cheekbones, cracked lips that bled at the corners. Her eyes were a pale gray, the color of the sky just before a blizzard. They tracked his movements, fixed on his hands, his boots. Caleb moved to the cast iron stove, yanked a thick wool blanket from a hook, and threw it at her. "Wrap up," he mumbled. She caught the blanket, her knuckles white and cracked with frost, but she didn't wrap it around herself. She just clutched it to her chest, her shoulders hunched. Caleb ignored her. He hung his hat on a nail and began to move with a practiced mechanical rhythm, pouring water from the bucket into the cast iron pot, swinging the crane over the fire, opening the jerky tin, tossing 2 leathery strips of meat onto the rough wooden table. He didn't offer to tend her feet. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't know how. He jabbed a scarred finger at a piece of meat. "Eat." She moved slowly towards the table. She didn't sit in a chair. She stood there, staring at the jerky. Her hands hovered over it, trembling. She looked from the meat to Caleb. Her gray eyes narrowed, assessing. "Eat," he repeated, reaching for a bottle of amber liquid on the shelf. He popped the cork with his thumb and took a long, burning swallow. The whiskey slid down his throat, a familiar fire numbing everything. The girl picked up a strip of jerky. She tore at it with a sudden animalistic savagery, swallowing it almost without chewing. It was difficult to watch. It sent a dull ache through Caleb's chest, a pain he'd thought long forgotten. He took another drink, turning his back to her to tend the fire. He prodded the logs with the iron poker. Sap hissed. "What's your name?" he asked, still not looking at her. Clara, her voice raspy, dry as sandpaper. "Caleb." Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. The wind rattled the tin plates on the shelf. Caleb stared into the orange flames, wondering if he should give her his bed. It was only a pallet of pine needles and horsehair, but at least it wasn't the floor. Then he heard the rustle of the wool blanket sliding to the floor. Caleb turned. Clara stood by the table. She had untied the ragged rope at her waist. The burlap sack dress fell to her feet. Beneath it, she wore a tattered cotton chemise, thin and frayed at the hem. Her arms and legs were a roadmap of bruises, yellowed, purpling, and a terrifying black. Some were old, but some was a chilling shipwreck. Caleb froze. The whiskey bottle slipped in his hand. "What in God's name are you doing?" She made no move to cover herself. She stood ramrod straight, though her whole body trembled with cold and adrenaline. Her face was a mask of stone. She looked him straight in the eye, her jaw tight. "Do you hit with your fist or your open hand?" she asked. Her voice didn't tremble. It was flat, clear, as if she were negotiating a job. "I just need to know so I know how to stand without breaking my jaw. And I don't like it in the dark. Please leave the lamp lit." The words hit Caleb harder than a kick from copper. The air seemed to be sucked from his lungs. His vision narrowed to a pinprick. He stood there, a big, scarred man holding a bottle of cheap moonshine, utterly defeated by a bruised, trembling girl in his kitchen. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't begging for her life. She was negotiating the terms of her own abuse, accepting it as a necessary transaction. $20. That's what she thought she owed him. A beating, or worse, in exchange for not freezing to death in the mud. A bile rose in Caleb's throat. A deep, sickening shame washed over him, not for himself, but for the world that had taught this girl that it was the only way to survive. He looked at her arms, the defensive posture she couldn't hide. The way she angled her body slightly to the left, anticipating a blow to the right side of her face. Caleb slammed the whiskey bottle onto the table. The sharp crack made Clara jump, her eyes squeezing shut, bracing for the blow, but it never came. Caleb bent at the knees, his joints creaking in the quiet room. He picked up the thick wool blanket, stepped towards her. She held her breath, her chest hitching in a tiny, terrified gasp. He didn't touch her skin. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, pulling it tight at the neck. He looked down at her, his dark eyes wide and haunted. "I don't hit women," he whispered, his voice cracked, dry and small. I don't want that." Clara slowly opened her eyes. The disbelief in them was a physical barrier, thick as iron. She searched his face looking for lies. Men always lied. Caleb stepped back, creating space between them. He felt clumsy, disgusting, simply for sharing a sex with her tormentors. "You sleep in the bed," he mumbled, turning away so she wouldn't see the shameful moisture welling in his eyes. He pointed to the corner of the room. "I sleep by the stove. If you want to lock the door, there's an iron bar by the woodpile. Just slide it into the bracket." He didn't wait for her reply, grabbed his coat, pulled it on, and lay down on the hard, drafty floorboards before the hearth, facing the fire. He heard the shuffling of her bare feet wrapped in burlap. He heard the creak of the rope bed as she sat down. He waited for the clang of the iron bar into the bracket, locking him away from his own space, keeping her safe from him. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The bar never fell. Caleb lay on the floor, listening to the wind howl outside and the shallow, wary breaths of the girl in his bed. He closed his eyes, the scent of pine smoke filling his nostrils, and realized with a terrifying clarity his quiet, empty life was over. The mountain man had let the outside world in, and it was bleeding onto his floor. Morning shattered like a cracked window pane, casting a weak, fractured light across the frost-covered floorboards. Caleb woke with the stiffness of a man who had slept on rough-hewn wood. He rolled his shoulders, his joints popping like dry twigs, and sat up. The bed in the corner was empty. A sudden, sharp panic lanced through his chest. He tossed aside the buffalo hide coat, his hand instinctively going to the Colt revolver slung on the back of the chair. Then he heard the scrape of iron against stone. He turned. Clara was by the hearth. She had on the burlap dress again, but over it, his own flea-bitten woolen sweater. It hung on her thin frame like a tent. She was kneeling on the stone hearth, scrubbing furiously at the soot-stained bricks with a steel brush. Her hands were raw, her knuckles bleeding faintly into the gray ash. "Stop!" Caleb croaked, his voice thick with sleep. She flinched, hunching her shoulders towards her ears, but didn't stop. The steel brush continued its frantic, circular motion. "I said stop." Caleb strode towards her, his boots thudding in the empty cabin. Clara dropped the brush. She sprang to her feet, pressing her back against the rough-hewn wood wall, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her breath was shallow and ragged. She was waiting for punishment. She had tried to work to prove her worth, to repay the debt of daily oxygen and warmth. And now somehow she had failed. Caleb rubbed his nose. A headache was blooming right behind his eyes. He didn't know what to do. He was a man who spoke only to trees and horses. The fragility of humans frightened him because he couldn't fix it with a hammer or a knife. He stepped past her, keeping a wide berth, and picked up the tin basin. He poured water from the bucket into it, set it on the stove, and added a handful of snow from the windowsill to warm it. He found a relatively clean scrap of cotton, tore it in half, and laid a bar of lye soap beside it. He pulled a wooden stool into the center of the room, then gestured to it. "Sit." Clara looked at the stool. She looked at him, wary. She left the wall and sat down rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Caleb knelt before her. He didn't ask permission. He guessed that asking would only confuse her further. He reached out, gently taking her right ankle. She gave a small choked sound, inhaling sharply, her foot tensing to pull away, but his hand was steady. He began to untie the jute twine that bound the burlap rags around her legs. The fabric was stiff with mud, melted snow, and dried blood. As he peeled away the last layer, the fetid smell of rot and dead flesh rose into the air. Her feet were a disaster. The soles were a patchwork of blisters and cuts. Her toes were swollen and purple from frostbite. It was a miracle she could walk at all. Caleb felt a hot, murderous rage simmer in his gut, directed at Amos. He swallowed it down. Anger wouldn't help now. He dipped the rag in the warm water, lathered it with lye soap, and began to wash her feet. He worked with a heartbreaking slowness, his large, calloused thumbs tracing over her bruised skin with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. The water in the basin turned a rusty brown. Clara sat motionless above him. She stared at the crown of his head, at the silver threads in his dark hair catching the morning light. Her chest rose and fell. This was all wrong. Men didn't kneel. Men didn't wash feet. Men took and broke and demanded. When the worst of the dirt had been scrubbed away, Caleb reached for the wooden bucket beside the stove and pulled out a pot of bear grease, mixed with comfrey root. He scooped out a large dollop, massaging it into her cracked heels and swollen toes. The salve smelled of earth and mint. "It'll sting for a bit," he mumbled, his eyes focused intently on his work. "Then it'll stop hurting." Suddenly, he felt a cold, wet drop fall onto the back of his hand. Caleb froze. He looked up. Clara's face was still stone, but tears were silently welling from beneath her lower lids, cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She wasn't sobbing. Her face wasn't even contorted. She was just leaking as though a dam had burst deep within her chest. "Don't," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I don't know what you want," she whispered. The roughness in her voice was agonizing. "You paid me $20. You want me to cook, I'll cook. You want me in your bed, I'll be there. But please don't trick me. Don't be kind, and then when you finally hit me, it'll hurt worse." Caleb sat back on his heels. He wiped his greasy hands on his trousers. He looked at her. Really looked at her, seeing the accumulated years of abuse etched onto a girl who hadn't yet lived a quarter of a century. "I didn't buy a slave, Clara," his voice was rough low. "I bought you from a monster, that's all. You don't owe me a goddamn thing. When the ice breaks this spring, you can take my horse and ride down to the valley. You can go wherever you want, but until the snow melts, you're stuck here. And in this house, we don't sweep the floor before we make coffee, and we wear boots." He stood, walked to the chest in the corner, and pulled out a pair of old, lamb-lined leather boots. He tossed them at her feet. They were 3 sizes, too big, but they were warm. "Put them on," he growled, turning his back to fiddle with the coffee grinder. "Then you can chop potatoes." Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of leather. He heard her sliding her feet into the boots, and for the first time since she'd walked into Miller's trading post, he heard her let out a long, shaky sigh that sounded remarkably like relief. By January, the mountain had become a white tomb. Snowdrifts swallowed the lower windows, trapping them in a world that smelled of boiled beans, damp wool, and wood smoke. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the suffocating quiet of predator and prey. It was the rhythm of a shared existence. Clara hummed a husky, resonant tune in her throat as she mended his shirt. She had filled out, the hollows in her cheeks rounding, the bruises fading to yellowed memories. Caleb found himself chopping more wood than necessary, just to linger by the window, watching the firelight catch the dark braid of her hair. It was a terrifying, fragile piece, and it shattered one Tuesday afternoon. Outside the cabin, Copper let out a shrill, panicked whinny, his heavy hooves drumming against the wooden fence. Caleb dropped the skinning knife. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped out into the wind that cut like a razor. 2 riders crested the ridge buried up to their chests in soft snow. Amos, clad in his reeking sheepskin coat, and the one-eared trapper Silas with a Winchester rifle slung across his saddle horn. They had smelled the $20 bill. Amos was stupid, but hunger made a man persistent. Well, Amos spat a wad of black chew staining the pristine snow. "Cozy little nest you got there, mountain man. We figured a fella who tosses cash around like that might have some charity to spare. Or else, we'll take the girl back." Behind Caleb, the heavy oak door creaked open. Caleb's stomach plummeted. "Stay inside," but Clara stood in the doorway, swimming in his oversized buffalo coat. She wasn't shivering. Amos grinned, revealing rotten teeth. "Well now, looking mighty plump," Silas cocked the Winchester. The metallic click was a gunshot in the frozen pines. "Move aside," Silas barked. Caleb's heavy Colt lay on the chair inside. He had only the short hunting knife at his belt. "Turn back," Caleb warned, his voice low lethal. Silas sneered and raised the rifle. Caleb lunged. He kicked through the thigh-deep snow, ducking under the panicked swish of Amos's horse's tail to grab the hot barrel of the Winchester just as Silas squeezed the trigger. The shot tore through the air. A searing white streak seared across Caleb's left shoulder, through wool and muscle. Ignoring the burn, Caleb twisted the barrel downward and drove the hunting knife deep into Silas's thigh. The trapper cried out, dropping the rifle, and slumped against his saddle, but Amos had reacted. He drew his heavy Colt, aiming squarely at Caleb's back as the mountain man struggled with the rifle. Caleb gritted his teeth, bracing for darkness. A second shot shattered the afternoon. Not Amos's gun. Amos blinked, looked down at the brutal hole that had suddenly appeared in his sheepskin coat. He toppled backward, hitting the snow with a wet, heavy thud. Caleb spun around. Clara stood on the porch, legs spread. Her hands gripped Caleb's heavy Colt. Smoke curled lazily from the muzzle. Her face was chalk white, but her hands were rock steady. Silas took one look at Amos's bleeding corpse in the snow, spurred his panicked horse, and galloped madly down the mountain. The ringing silence returned. Caleb pressed a hand to his shoulder. Hot blood soaked through the woolen shirt slick and fast. Clara lowered the gun. She looked at the corpse, then at Caleb. She could have shot him. She could have taken the horse, the provisions, and ridden to freedom. Instead, she trudged through the snow, stopping inches from him. She pressed her soot-stained fingers to his hand. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice even, but her pale eyes frantically scanning the wound. "Grazed me," Caleb grunted, as the adrenaline drained his knees began to buckle. Clara slipped her shoulder under his good arm. "Lean on me," and for the first time in his life, Caleb allowed his weight to rest on another human being. Inside, the heat of the stove hit them like a wall. Clara pushed him onto the bed. She ripped open his shirt, grabbed the bottle of whiskey and a clean linen rag. She poured the liquor directly onto the torn flesh. Caleb gritted his teeth, watching her. Her hands were sure, unhesitatingly efficient. "You didn't run," he managed, his words tasting of dull metal. She tied off the bandage, then sat back on the edge of the mattress. She looked at the blood on her hands, then up at his face. The defensive, hollow, wounded girl from the trading post was gone. In her place was something forged of steel and winter wind. "The ice is a long way from breaking, Caleb," she whispered, a faint but genuine smile touching her cracked lips. "Besides, if I leave, who's going to make the coffee?" Caleb reached out his good arm. His rough, calloused fingers brushed her cheek. She didn't flinch. Closing her eyes, she leaned her head ever so slightly into that touch.